Yeah, well, Snowfalling on Cedars was my first novel. It appeared in 1994. Um, for the previous 10 years, I had been working as a high school teacher on Bainbridge Island in Washington State, which is about a half hour west of Seattle by ferry. And as part of my curriculum, I took note of the fact that Bainbridge was the first place in the United States of America that everybody of Japanese descent was forced to leave after the executive order that came down after Pearl Harbor. Uh, these people were visible targets. They looked like the enemy, and it became perfectly acceptable in the eyes of the government to treat them as non-citizens and to treat them as potential a threat. And so here I found myself living in this place where this was the most significant historical moment in the history of our community. Um, if you're a school teacher, you know about it and you try to bring it into the curriculum. And then what happened? So I had that. But then I began to realize in 1994, well, I started writing it much earlier than that. So say in the mid to late 80s, began to realize, hey, a lot of these people to whom this happened are still here. They're older now, but they're here. And so as a teacher, I took an interest in their stories. And as I heard their stories, my interest became also the interest of an author. I began to see the insult and the tragedy in all of this and the humanity of it, that these were real lives. This happened to real people because I was talking to the real people to whom it happened, face to face. And this was the genesis of the novel for me, trying to find a structure, a storytelling structure in which I could illuminate this episode, this shameful episode in our national history. There are a number of sort of genres that get blended in this novel. So, yeah, it's historical fiction, it's a love story, it's a war novel, and it's a courtroom drama. It's all of those things at once. So, when I was looking for the proper structure or form in which I could fully address and explore the ideas at the heart of this story, I hit on the courtroom drama. In fact, the book opens in the courtroom. Uh, and the entire structure of the book from beginning to end is of a trial unfolding. And as it unfolds, as each witness takes the stand, say, you get another piece of the puzzle, and you end up sort of going back in time with them, so that even though this trial is unfolding in the 50s, you begin to learn about things that happened in the 30s and then in the 40s via this courtroom structure. And I like the courtroom structure because it has an inherent drama. So even if you're not a novelist, even if you just pay attention to court cases, as media does, you know, there's always a dramatic element to it because there's this question up front, are they guilty? And so you automatically have somebody turning the pages wanting to know the answer to that question. It's built into the genre. So that's a foundation on which, you can rely, and you can set up that question from page one and move forward from there. Now, the character of Ishmael Chambers, who you mentioned, he is the owner and sole writer for the local newspaper in this small community. The novel's set on a isolated island, far north of Seattle, out at sea, where it has to fend for itself morally and culturally. Um, it has to find its own way of being, and there are long-standing feuds and animosity because when you live on an island and there are not a lot of people there, that's inevitably going to develop. There's always a sort of delicacy when you live on an island. you're all kind of, in a way, it's paradise. In a way, you're all trapped there together. And so you have to be really careful about your conduct. And all of this arises at the time of the trial. It sort of comes out into the open. Uh, and Ishmael is the repository sort of for it all because he owns the newspaper. So he's at the trial every day trying to find a way to deliver to his fellow citizens the facts of the matter. And so he becomes a kind of focal point along the way in this story. A story like Snow Falling on Cedars, I felt, needed a large cast of characters because this is a story ultimately about communal responsibility for justice, you know. And so what is this community? And who lives here and who are they? And to sort of disperse that out among many, many people so that readers get a composite picture, that by going into the hearts and minds of maybe a dozen people, you get a sense of this community and of why communal responsibility for justice can be so complex. And so, yeah, there's a large cast of characters. And one who I like is, the character who's charged with murder is charged with killing a fisherman named Carl Heine Jr. And Carl Heine Jr., his mother, Etta, is, kind of a villain in the book. I mean, she's a very hard person, very sort of uncaring person. But her husband, Carl Heine Sr., is a character I really like because as much as he feels sort of under the thumb of his wife and feels ultimately like he needs to do what she wants, he also has his own morality. He also has his own take on things. And so he's sort of stuck in this position. He wants to do the right thing. He's just a little bit hapless. He's trying, but he can't necessarily make happen what he wants to have happen. So that's a character I like. But the character who I really like the most is the defense attorney, whose name is Nels Goodmanson. Now, it's not too much of a stretch from Goodmanson to my name, Guterson. And in fact, my father was for 45 years a criminal attorney, and I went to his cases on occasion. But more than that, being his son, I knew what he was about in terms of his moral vision. And uh, I was able to bring that to bear on this character of Nels Goodmanson. And that was nice for me to be able to do that. It made it feel good. There's a love story here, and it's between a girl of Japanese descent and the young Ishmael, living in a place where a sort of interracial relationship, it has to be, pursued on the sly. And they do that. They actually meet as very young children in an innocent way who just grow up together because they live near each other, playing together on the beach. But as time goes by, of course, and they arrive at adolescence, Ishmael begins to feel more deeply about it. And so does Hatsua. And so their relationship becomes romantic. And then, of course, the internment happens, and that breaks them up. So Hatsua has to go to a camp, and Ishmael joins the military. So now they're broken up by facts, by historical facts. But there's also another thing going on there, which is as much as Hatsua feels an attraction and a love for Ishmael, it's not quite what she envisions for herself. And it doesn't 100% work for her as love as it does for him. And that happens often to people, and she feels in her heart of hearts that even though this is a really nice guy, Ishmael's a super guy. I mean, she childhood friend, nothing wrong with him, but it's just not quite working. And at a certain point, after they're separated, she accepts that and goes another direction. And he comes home from war just traumatized, having lost his arm. And he hears, hey, I'm married to someone else now from Hatsuwa. And this just throws him into a really deep hole of bitterness, which is where we find him when the story opens. Oh, I should say, as far as sort of a genesis for this, like where does all this come from? So I mentioned earlier that I was a high school teacher. I started teaching in the fall of 83, and Snow Falling on Cedars came out in 94. So it's about a 10-year period. And of course, I'm around adolescents all the time, and I'm reminded of the way in which, love and romance and relationships can really be a very, very heavy, heavy, heavy thing for them, just by being in their presence every day. So that was significant to me because as we get older, we can sort of look back and dismiss it as puppy love but it's not to the person who's in the throes of it. To the person who's in the throes of it, it's the most important thing that's ever happened to them in their life. And this happened to me, by the way, because I met my wife when I was 17. So I know how this sort of thing can take over your existence. And it did. So there were these other points of genesis. It wasn't just sort of storytelling matters. There were some personal and biographical elements to this developing this love story.